From the intricate networks beneath a forest floor to the canopy above it, our next conversation asks, what ecosystems themselves can teach us about intelligence? To guide it, I'd like to invite our moderator, Mr. Niki Mardas, Executive Director of Global Canopy, to take his seat. Niki, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be with you today. Thank you, Ruth, for that brilliant introduction. Thank you, Demokritos, for all you do, for this wonderful framing. Thank you, World Human Forum, who have become friends and who bring such a human touch as well as the intellectual touch. I admire you all so much. We are going on a journey today that requires two beautiful minds, so I must ask Yadvinder Malhi and Armand Marie Leroi to join me, please, on the stage. So, Armand, Professor of Evolutionary Developmental Biology at Imperial College, author of The Lagoon, How Aristotle Invented Science, so we couldn't be in better company. Welcome, Armand. Yadvinder, Professor of Ecosystem Science at Oxford University and Director of the Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery. And a dear friend, I know you, I live in Oxford, we work on trees. Yadvinder's one of the great tropical biologists, so it's such a pleasure to be in both your company here. And whatever, no matter how good the company, we have one constraint, and that is time. We only have 40 minutes to ask ourselves about a huge topic, the wisdom of ecosystems. And I'm going to ask for a clicker so I can use the slides. Thank you so much. So this is the topic of our session here today. And in order to stretch our minds, in order to use this time wisely, we are going to take a journey. We're going to ask ourselves a question. Is an ecosystem intelligent? Let's ask ourselves, does a forest think? So that's the journey that we're going to go on over the next 38 minutes, I guess now. And we can begin our journey. Think about that for a second. Does a forest think? Is a forest intelligent? Does it think as an ecosystem? And we must turn first to the wisdom of the ecosystem, the wisdom of all of you. So perhaps you could put up your hands if you think a forest thinks. I'm going to say half, more than half. Fantastic. What a beautiful audience you are. Open-minded, wonderful people. We will bring you in again later to continue tapping into the wisdom of the ecosystem. So in order, Ruth set us up so well, as have the previous speakers, in order to begin our journey, we must ask, what is intelligence? Let's lay that out. Let's get that over with. We've had a little bit about that. I think we're going to hear from our friends more on this question of what is intelligence. And on the journey to answer that question, the journey to the forest, I have been advised by a friend of mine never to do an event like this without props. And so I'm going to ask a question about different forms of intelligence. I found some rocks on the way with my friend Morton. I think I put them in my pocket. I was hoping for a big kind of boulder rock, but I found these in a cafe. So we have some rocks, little rocks. Are rocks Intelligent more than human life? Some of you know that phrase. That's one question. We have a professor here next to the rocks. Is the professor intelligent? It's a question you can also answer at the end. We have a computer here. I've turned off the ringer, but Claude never turns off. Claude controls me. And so Claude is still on. So we'll put Claude here. Is Claude intelligent? We will ask ourselves. Then we have another professor. Is he intelligent? This is a question we will address. I'm using our time wisely, you can see. And then we have a banana. Perhaps the most intelligent of all is the banana. Who knows? I must say that the wisdom of ecosystems did a few wonderful things as I set out to come here, always a little late as usual. It provided me with a shirt. Ayuton Krenak, great indigenous leader, offered me a shirt because I looked a bit shabby. So I'm very proud to be wearing this one. Krika Fontes offered me some shoes. And she also brought out a bag of amazing artifacts from the Amazon. We, about a month ago, hosted Adano Magua, a shaman and doctor from the Amazon. And I got these, but Krika took them back to Brazil, and she's just given them back to me. And they are a living part of the forest, so they go maybe here with the banana, so we can think about Adana, and we can think about the intelligence of all of these things. And so, with that done, I think we can ask our friends. Yadvinder, let's start with you. Intelligence, consciousness, sentience. Can we start with that?
Yeah. Thank you, Niki. Thank you for that unusual introduction. So I think before we get into what types of things are intelligent, I think it's a useful distinction to make between intelligence, sentience, and consciousness. Because in debate today, but I think over this weekend, we might see ourselves drifting between the terms and thinking they're the same. And at least one definition I would propose is that sentience is what it's like to feel something, whether it's heat or cold or pleasure or pain. Consciousness is for it to be something like to feel that. So to feel, if a tree is conscious, it feels like something to be a tree or other entities. And they're not necessarily the same as intelligence. We'll get onto the definition of intelligence in a moment. And they can be the same in certain contexts, but there are other contexts in which something could be intelligent but not conscious. Something could be sentient but have low intelligence, etc. So it's useful to be aware that these are three different concepts that we should be at least alert to which one we're using. And if we prove, for example, that a forest is intelligent, we're not necessarily proving that it's conscious, as one example.
Well, thanks for beginning us on the journey. And Armand, I know you've been bold enough to give us a definition that we can start with. What is intelligence, Armand?
Yeah, so we're going to discuss a lot of definitions of intelligence, but I'll give you one just to start off with, that it is an entity's, and there's a special word there, ability to take information from the environment and process it in some ways. So it's fundamentally about information and the ability to process it. I'd say that as that definition, which is a very general one, has two consequences. The first is that a computer is intelligent, any computer. The Antikythera mechanism, which I saw this morning, is intelligent in that sense, being the very earliest computer that we know of, and so is Claude, certainly. It also has the consequence that all living things are intelligent. And in a very special way, not even just because they extract information via their senses from the environment, but because natural selection itself, and Ruth alluded to this, is a process by which organisms become fit to their environment, and insofar doing so, they gather and embody information about their environment in their adaptations. So in this sense, a banana is absolutely intelligent.
Thank you so much. Can you talk to that a bit more? The banana's intelligence because it's a product of evolution. Evolution is an intelligence sifting machine, and therefore the banana's intelligence? That's the way you mean?
That's exactly what I mean, yeah. That is to say, natural selection makes choices, as it were, in the way organisms adapt. And that process, which is critically a goal-directed process via the agency of natural selection, that, as it were, sorts out information from the environment.
So, Armand, thank you. You've dared to give us a definition. We're going to hold that. We're going to work with it. We're going to come back to it. And to me, it's a striking... Can you say it one more time, the definition, just so we've got it in our minds?
Sure. Intelligence is the ability of an entity to extract information from the environment and manipulate it in some fashion.
Okay, perfect. Let's go, Yadvinder, to how you see this. And I know you've provided a slide for us, great scientist that you are. You have been comprehensive. So over to you. Would you like the slide up?
Well, it's interesting. I think because that definition of the intelligence you provide, which I'm sympathetic to, for most of the 20th century science, and most of the history of science, would be an extremely radical definition of intelligence. So if you go to the next slide. In 2007, there was a paper by Legg and Hunter where they reviewed in the scientific literature the definitions of intelligence they could find. And they came up with 70 different definitions of intelligence. And what I did in this slide is condense them in the context of this debate into different types. And there's also been an evolution in definitions that are popular over time. And if you go back to the earlier 20th century, the definitions very much centered on the basis that humans are intelligent, what definition that could we come up with that distinguished humans from other entities, other beings. It was almost self-defining that. And so the definitions tended to be about intelligence is about the capacity for abstract reasoning, for language, these sort of concepts that are very human-centric concepts. As the century has proceeded, the last century proceeded, it expanded to essentially allow for all things with brains to be intelligent in one form or another. So expanded across the animal kingdom. That initially debates around elephants and apes and parrots and crows, but then more recently an acceptance that even animals with small brains like bees, insects, can be individually intelligent. And then more on the controversial element, and we'll hear a bit about that, is an argument that entities, living beings without brains, can be intelligent, that intelligence can be distributed in a plant or in a fungus, and organisms without brains, or possibly even in a microbe, have elements of intelligence. You can go beyond that, and we'll touch on that as we get into this forest argument, to whether collections of entities can be intelligent, or whether systems of entities that are not related to each other can be intelligent. And we'll explore that a little bit later in the debate. So there's this whole range of definitions. Armand, your definition is right there on the right end of this spectrum of possible definitions. If you're curious to know where Aristotle would have been in terms of his definition.
So Aristotle, yeah. So Aristotle is reasonably clear insofar that he paradigmatically thinks that humans are intelligent. He thinks that there are life is, and of course he was a great biologist, is ordered by the complexity of souls. A bit of a mysterious term, but we can think of it this way. Plants have a nutritive soul, animals have a nutritive soul, and a sensory soul, and humans have those, and we have a rational soul as well. And I suppose when he speaks about intelligence in the way that one might have done earlier on, it's very much focused upon the rational soul. That's humans paradigmatically. However, when we get into actually understanding what he means by soul, it looks actually like a much more general concept. These are systems, homeostatic systems, information processing systems that keep creatures alive. So giving a somewhat more sympathetic view to how he thinks about it, I'd say he'd actually, if he were to look at our definition, he would say, yep, that's very much what creatures are doing. And what is, I think, most important about Aristotle is that he thinks that all these systems are designed for a goal, for the well-being and reproduction of creatures, to keep them alive. That's what it's all about. And that is the thing that makes his biology so wonderful and clear, and actually so much like our own, even though it's more than 2,500 years old.
So where do you situate? So we've heard that Armand, you're on the right hand, so the far side over there with your definition. But I'm hearing that we've got Aristotle over here. Is that right? On the left?
Aristotle's operating across several different levels. Yes, in part he's very much on the left on the cognitive human side, but as I say, when we get into the actual guts of his biology, it's not looking that, it's looking at a much more abstract kind of process. I'm hedging my bets here.
You're hedging your bets,
yes,
which is good. We'll come
agree.
back and press you further on that. But I do hear that goal orientation is fundamental in his understanding.
Goal orientation is fundamental to Aristotle. He's a teleologist.
Okay, so let's deepen on the teleology. Before we do that, I know from our friends at World Human Forum that they were, and Democritus, they were inspired by some of the work of our friend Merlin Sheldrake, who wrote his book Entangled Life, was in some way an inspiration for the title of this conference. And unfortunately, Merlin's in Panama at the moment. He couldn't join us here, otherwise he would be with us today. But I think when, Yadvinder, you talk about fungi, I really recommend his book, and thinking there are many wonderful videos where we see that intelligence is in the fingertips, and you can track the fungal decision-making going up one path, coming back down the path, and then splitting into two paths, finding the intelligence of the fingertips rather than the centralized brain that we think of. So somewhere to deepen. So let's run with agency for a moment. Yadvinder, what's the take on Aristotle's agency as applied now to your model?
I think this comes to a key challenge that we need to think about. Is intelligence just the processing of information, or does it need to be accompanied by a goal in that processing? So maybe I think the next slide talks to this a little bit. This is sometimes called the thermostat dilemma as well. That on one hand, we can think of anything that processes information and responds to it in some form is a form of intelligence. On the other hand, we have a goal-directed view, most clearly in an animal, but we could argue in any living organism. And a thermostat is something that processes information and sends an output depending on that. So it's one of the simplest forms of technology. There's a continuum between the thermostat and Claude in terms of machines that do that. The challenge with that definition of information processing, it makes intelligence almost universal, which might be appealing in some cases, but does it also have the risk of turning it into a meaningless concept if everything is intelligent? So one example you could take is a river that is non-living, that it's dammed, it absorbs the information that it's dammed, and it comes up with a solution to that, which is to reroute itself around the blockage. There's no living entity involved in that. Is that river intelligent? Or does the river need to have a goal into what it's trying to do, persist or whatever, to make it intelligent? This is relevant to, I think, to our question about whether an ecosystem can be intelligent as well.
So is a river intelligent?
I would lean on not, because I think you need a stronger sense of goal there. But I think there are many worldviews that would fully argue that a river should be considered intelligent just as much as a living entity would as well.
My rock?
I think some worldviews would say that, but I think it's a challenge, because then, at least from a Western scientific perspective, to admit intelligence into the non-living world or to large scale.
And of course, we'll explore this over the coming days and hear many different viewpoints on this. Armand, do you have something to think when you hear us go from the thermostat all the way down to Claude, and we've heard your definition probably favors that set. You've already said that they are intelligent. How about the river? How about the rock? The river's responding to the circumstances incoming. You could say, by your definition, it's intelligent?
No. So let's be clear. So computers are designed artifacts. There's a sense in which living things are designed not by a designer per se, but by natural selection. And that is what gives artifacts and living things in common a goal-oriented property, right? This teleology, this designed property. Rocks are not. Rocks are just the way they are. Rivers are not. They are just the way they are as a consequence of blind physical forces. Yadvinder's being very, very provocative. He doesn't believe that a river is any more intelligent than I do. And so I think it's very important to make that distinction. Even allowing that there are many degrees of intelligence, right? That's not disputed. So we do want to allow that without being completely promiscuous in our arguments in attributing intelligence to the universe as a whole.
Well, thank you for the clear no. Does anyone think that a rock is intelligent, that a river is intelligent? Have we got any hands? There are some hands among the organizers as well. So we should really debate this over the coming days. Are rivers or rocks intelligent? So let's go to another dimension. We've been talking about a somewhat individual form of intelligence. You've mentioned in your analysis of the 70 forms more collective intelligence as stepping stones. We're not getting yet to the ecosystems. But Yadvinder, community intelligence. What can you say about that?
I think there's some forms of community intelligence that I think are now accepted as intelligent. So the most obvious one is a colony of honeybees or a social insect where you've got things, an individual bee is intelligent, but the collection of bees can do things that emerge that no individual bee could do. And I think many biologists are comfortable with that because there's natural selection operating. The bees are related to each other, and that collective group of bees has natural selection working on it. If they're better than other collectives, and therefore there's a selection process that can select for that colony to be more and more intelligent to solve problems. And the colony can solve problems and adapt to problems, such as a bear attacking the hive or something like that, that an individual bee that's different from the response of an individual bee. So you could think of a colony almost like a liquid computer, where you've got individual elements interacting with each other to produce a larger collective intelligence. So at that level, I think there is a clear case for collective intelligence. The more challenge comes when those elements are not related to each other and the community that's interacting is shifting in composition over time.
But I also, I hear that, but I also heard the relationality, the kinship is important somehow here. Is that right? The fact that bees are kin?
I think in the sense of making sense of this in the light of evolution, there are processes within conventional natural selection that say that closely related entities can be favored in selection. The group is favored in selection rather than just the individual. So in terms of evolutionary biology, I think many evolutionary biologists would be comfortable with that.
Well, let's go to the evolutionary biologist and let's bring Aristotle back in, because I think he had quite a lot to say about bees.
Oh, Aristotle is brilliant on bees. I could occupy all the rest of the time talking about what Aristotle had to say about bees. He loves them because they're political animals, and he thinks we're a political animal. Of course, he wrote a politics, and he goes from that, from bee politics, but he's also fascinated by the fact that they appear to have 3 sexes. I won't go into the details, but if you want to read and believe that Aristotle is a scientist, read him in Historia Animalium about bees and how those three sexes work and the evidence he adduces for it and how he's torn between the evidence and his theories, and he says, well, but the evidence matters. That's all I'll say about Aristotle and bees, because it's just so wonderful.
Yeah, and when we chatted before, your love of Aristotle is palpable in your face and your energy, and it's made me love Aristotle more, and being in the Lyceum today was also a contributor. So thank you to the organizers for making this a reality. So where do we go from here? Let's talk about, I think I'm seeing the clock. We have 16 minutes of this wonderful discussion left. And so we better get to the forest. Let's get to the ecosystem and start wrapping these thoughts, quick though they've been, into, oh, we have something else. I forgot about this wonderful thing. Degrees of agency. I think we've left that behind.
But I think let's touch on it, because I think it's helpful. So this was when we were thinking about agency, and this is just a plot that you may want to disagree with our positioning. We've got agency as the bottom axis, and we've got the degree of information processing as the vertical axis. And what I'd argue is that ecosystems process huge amounts of information. All the individual entities in an ecosystem are doing complicated things and reading the environment and dealing with it. So the sum total of information in an ecosystem is huge. And the question is, how much agency does an ecosystem have? So you might question that. And then just in the context of this wider session, I've placed AI towards the left. Lots of information processing, low degrees of agency. And I placed the thermostat at the bottom, low information processing, some agency, and animals and potentially plants in the upper right there, and fungi in the upper right. So that just a little map of, and others may want to disagree, but I think it's a way of bringing AI and animate intelligence into the same framing to think about these things.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to see that we are not on the right, far right.
Oh, I love octopus.
Yeah, we all love octopuses, and yeah, it's a rare case of human arrogance not putting itself at the far right. So thank you for putting us in our right place, but maybe we need to come even more this way. But let's move on. So ecosystems, I mean, would one of you like to kick us off on because we're now with 14 minutes to go, and we'd like to bring at least a bit more audience participation if we can. Talk to us now a little bit about ecosystems. We've arrived. What can we say? How can we, I mean, in some ways ecosystems are, you can think of them as resource allocators. Can we start there?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think the challenge, as I said, is when you get to organisms that are not related to each other in a close kinship, interacting with each other, lots of relationships going on. Where is the goal? Does that collection have a goal? And before we get to ecosystems, a market can be an interesting analogy where you've got lots of entities doing things, shifting boundaries. A market could be argued to be doing intelligent things and trying to allocate consumption of resources, use of resources, using price as a tool to do that. It's obviously non-optimal because it's limited in what it accounts for, and we have all the problems with markets, so they're not perfect. But within those constraints, it's acting as intelligently as it can. Now, an ecosystem, you could be thought of as doing something similar. It's trying to find a solution for its composition of how best to get resources, nutrients, water, sunlight, and allocate them as a sum across its organisms that it's composed of. So does an ecosystem have a goal? Now that's an interesting question, because where would that goal come from? Or is the goal simply the sum of the goals of the individual species in the ecosystem? I'd argue that there are ways that ecosystems organisms interact. A tree may form a symbiosis with a fungi that forms little relationships within components, and that the ecosystem is more than the simple aggregation of the species and the individual organisms in there. And so there's a collective form of intelligence that emerges through those interactions. And how does that emerge? We can get to, but I'd like to give Armand a moment to respond to that.
So I think there's much of what I would agree with there, right? Ecosystems are composed of many information processing entities, organisms, and there are very many complicated interactions between them. But like a market, I suppose what I struggle to see is why we should attribute intelligence to the system as a whole rather than the sum of its individual parts. And the reason I do so is twofold, I suppose. The first is that it's very difficult for me to see how this higher level design, where it comes from. Natural selection doesn't operate on ecosystems. Natural selection operates upon individuals. And although we can agree that there are emergent properties, they're not designed as such. But there's sort of a second problem that I worry about, and this often comes when I speak to ecologists, rather evolutionary biologists, is that they often talk about the global properties of ecosystems, qualities like resilience and homeostasis, and so on and so forth. And I worry about that because as if there is a sort of a wisdom of nature which is just going to kind of help us through, and that it's all going to be okay, because it's very easy to be led from the idea that there's a sort of a global intelligence, that things all sort of self-regulate, to the idea that, you know, we don't have to worry about it that much, when in fact the evidence suggests that we do. As you know well, the history of life has been a history of disasters, from snowball Earth to mass extinctions to ice ages. It's just happened again and again. And I'm not sure at all that I see much evidence of all these intelligent and resilient and homeostatic properties that are just going to keep everything ticking along.
Just because we're coming to the end, and we're going to come straight to you, Yadvinder, but I'm hearing that we're getting to a sort of, to simplify this highly complex thing, there's a sort of Gaia-like, I mean, yesterday, Yuton mentioned James Lovelock. We've got a Gaia-like approach, a superintelligence. The connection of the sum of the parts is real, is there. That's one way of seeing the world. Otherwise, we're back to ask the audience that we did at the beginning. You can get intelligence, but it's sort of a collection of what is surfacing from a group of highly, in this case, intelligent individuals. So we've got this dichotomy. Yadvinder, where are we on that line?
I'd agree with you that actually, as an ecologist who spends a lot of time in forests, I push back against this idea of the balance of nature, the equilibrium of nature. I see a forest, or any form of nature, actually, as this constant negotiation between species, of a relationship, of endlessly forming and reforming relationships. And that, to me, is an ecosystem-level intelligence. It's not I think a brain that's in equilibrium is not as intelligent as a brain that's constantly renegotiating its understanding, its functioning in the world. And in terms of where does this selection come from, one way to think is that there isn't just one forest and one non-forest. In any forest, there's endless shades of forest, which are different relative compositions of different trees and species, different associations. And they're effectively, the persistence of which ones, they're effectively competing against each other. So if in one patch of forest, a tree forms a relationship with a fungus, it forms a cycle that's a little bit better than the neighboring tree that hasn't formed that relationship and is more likely to persist over time. So these cycles emerge, and persistence of what works is a way that more and more sophisticated relationships emerge over time, and you could argue a more intelligent forest emerges over time.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm hearing you're taking my simple dichotomy there, but you're giving it the nuance it needs. But I also hear that we've got a tick in the box for forest think. I'm going to say, Armand, where are you?
Yeah, so I just want to be clear. You know, Yadvinder's proposing a radical reformulation of evolutionary biology, in which he's proposing that ecosystems and communities are being selected and competing against each other, as it were, much like individuals and species do, in order to provide these happy outcomes of beautiful self-regulating systems. And that's a wonderful vision. I'm just not sure I see much evidence for it in the history of life. But I think it's a radical idea, a deeply radical idea, and I suggest that he write a paper on it.
That he might be?
You write a paper on it.
Yeah, oh, there you go. We've got a paper coming. That's good news. Let's go back to Ruth's meteor. So meteor comes down and destroys an ecosystem. Is it goal-oriented? Is it, Yadvinder, what happens next? Have we got competition of different forms of ecosystem?
I think when we look at the empirical evidence, like that when a meteor did hit 65 billion years ago, is you see systems getting more and more complicated, nutrient cycles, water cycles, etc., building up in complexity over time. And I think the model that I just suggested of different permutations of ecosystem, a continuum of types of ecosystem were being tried out. And the ones that are more effective and more persistent sort of spread over time. So yes, I would argue that you see increasing complexity. I don't believe in happy equilibrium homeostasis, but I do believe in increasing complexity of relationships over time that develop in an ecosystem as it works out more and more. The collective works out ways of using and sharing resources.
It's all about relationships, which is, I think we can take comfort from that as we build relationships in the room. Because we had the luck to be the first panel, this conversation could go on and on and on, and it will, I think. But we want to set a good example because it's so important that we get the collective, the wisdom of this ecosystem. So can we ask for a question? I think we'll only have time, well, maybe we could take one or maybe two together and then have quick closing responses. Please, noting the time, please keep to short questions and not interventions, but questions. So can we start up here, please? Can we get a mic to you?
Thank you for this enlightening conversation, discussion, and all these beautiful questions that we have to think about. Now, I would, as far as I understand, this idea, the word, not the idea, the word of intelligence becomes problematic because you start from Aristotle and cognitive faculties and you finish with ecosystems, and each group comprises or includes different faculties, different actions, activities. So would you please, to be short, would you please explain us why do 20th and 21st century insist on the word intelligence to design all those phenomena? And then next, very few.
I think we have to stick with one, but...
Okay.
Okay,
no problem.
Thank you. Could you say your background very quickly? Who are we hearing
I'm
from?
a philosopher, comparative philosophy.
Thank you so much.
Chinese and Greek philosophy.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a trick of the light. I see one more behind, and I'm sorry, I just can't see so well here. Oh, yeah, well, I'm afraid we've allocated. Oh, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. So the next panel in an ecosystem form will come in this direction. So apologies. A quick question, please.
Hello, very quick question. So what I heard at the end was adaptation and complexity is an indicator of intelligence. So the healthiest the ecosystem is, the more complex relationships it needs to have, that they constantly adapt to becoming equilibrium. It's never stable. But from the little genetics I've studied in college, it's also the species that actually were breeded together to be similarly in genes. They were actually the most unhealthy one and the least adaptive ones. So the complex relationships that were formed when you combine different genes from the same species or family species, those were much healthier and able to be intelligent because they survived natural selection, which is also constant, because then they also have to breed with a different species or a different in the same genetic animal on the same species. So just to wrap it all up, do you think that intelligence has to do with diversity and complexion within relationships as well? And what does that say about human connections and relationships as well, if someone is intelligent in their social life?
Thank you so much. So we're going to do quick wrap-ups here, a couple of minutes each, and we can then take the conversation outside in the breaks. Who would like to go first?
I believe that the last question was about intelligence and diversity. Again, I think it depends precisely on what kind of diversity you're talking about. When we're talking about human diversity, much as Ruth said, there's no doubt that human diversity, insofar that we can work together and generate goals of our own collectively, can increase our intelligence collectively and do so in far better than we can individually. Does diversity within species necessarily increase the intelligence of a system? Yes, in the sense of increasing its processing power, not necessarily in the sense of giving some overarching increase in computing. But that brings us back again to the question of goals and their levels. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Armand. Thank you so much for everything you've said today. Can you address this intelligence question? Why are we so obsessed with intelligence?
Yes, I think if I understood the question, it was, why do we go for this broader definition? Isn't the definition, the classical definition, you could argue, of humans are intelligent and maybe apes, and that's enough? Isn't that adequate? If that's the way I understood the question. Obviously, it is a matter of definitions, but I would argue that the definitions we use have consequences, and that definition of intelligence could be argued as a very Cartesian one, which aims to emphasize what makes humans different from the rest of the living world, and that humans have the capacity for intelligence that the rest of the living world doesn't. Whereas I think some of these more information, adaptation-based ones actually emphasize more the continuum between humans, animals, plants, others, that actually intelligence, as in solving problems, adapting to changes in information, is something that much of the living world, whether organisms or groups of organisms, does. And it matters in that sense, because I think it actually perhaps is one pathway to having a more integrated and connected view of where humanity stands with the rest of the living world.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I think we end there. I take continuum of relationality, and we must all thank, please, our two panelists for this wonderful conversation.